Welcome back, Bears fans, to another episode of the Chicago Audible. And would you look at that, we're now halfway through the month of July. Summer is rolling right along, and before you know it, Bears camp is going to be right here in front of us. I'm your host, Will DeWitt, and I'm so excited to be back with you for another episode this week, as today's show is the second to last installment of our annual summer series, Countdown to Camp. We've previewed nearly every single player on this roster, and it's time to wrap up the Bears defense with its final preview, as today's show is all about the Bears safeties. Here with me today to break down this position, it's my co-host, Mason West, Nicholas Moriano. He's down in New Orleans for the weekend. He'll be back next week for our quarterback preview episode. But Mason, man, glad to have you on. Excited to talk Bears safeties. And if I remember correctly, we're a tandem as well, just like the safeties. So I'm the free safety and you're the strong safety, right?
Strong side all day. I'll do the dirty work in the box. Unsung hero. I'm okay with it.
Perfect. Hey, we have an unsung hero-ish that we'll talk about here later on in the show. Someone that I am a fan of here on this Bears defense. And Mason, to kind of kick off today's show, we have some Bears-related news here to discuss at the top. The deadline to give Allen Robinson a long-term deal has come and gone. The Bears did not find a way to get that deal done. Not a surprise. We've been kind of hearing that through the media over the last couple of weeks. And personally, disappointed, but yet again, this is kind of what I saw coming. And I believe, I don't know, you saw this some wide receiver rankings just come out too. Where did you see those, and where was A-Rob ranked?
Yeah, so ESPN did a wide receiver ranking. Basically, they surveyed 50 league executive, coaches, scouts, players, and then combined all the data to give a top 10. So I'm going to read off a name, and you tell me if you think Allen Robinson is better than that player. Because I'm just curious. Devontae Adams, number 1.
No.
DeAndre-Hopkins.
Yes.
Stephon Diggs.
Yes.
Tyreek Hill.
No, but that's just a production issue. Different type
Julio
of player.
Jones.
Julio Jones? Julio Jones today, Allen Robinson's better.
Keenan Allen.
Yeah, I still go with A-Rob.
Mike Evans.
I'm going to give a slight edge to Mike Evans.
Michael Thomas.
Yeah, I'll give a slight edge to Michael Thomas.
DK Metcalf.
A-Rob.
And in the 10th spot, A.J. Brown.
Wow, and yeah, I still believe Allen Robinson is a notch above A.J. Brown. So A-Rob snubbed?
He was an honorable mention.
Wow.
Yeah, so I don't know. Again, this is looking from executives, coaches, scouts, players. Is that kind of where the Bears feel that A-Rob is? Do they feel the same way that they weren't willing to pay him maybe like a top 5, top 10 receiver based on those kind of things? Perhaps. And now we just got to wait, see what he does this year. The thing that's good and bad about him is he's the guy that if he gets snubbed, if he feels disrespected, he's going to work harder, which is good for the Bears. It's not great for him. And then see what the offseason brings and see if he gets brought back. Yeah,
exactly. It's kind of where we're at, kind of what we thought we were going to have as well. And I don't know, I saw PFF's ranking, and they had A-Rob 4th right after Tyreek Hill. That feels a little better. But regardless, Allen Robinson's going to play the 2021 season on the franchise tag, and hopefully with some better quarterback play, the Bears find whatever they're looking for out of him in order to kind of give him the money that he is asking for. And before we jump into the Bears safeties, I do need to call just a quick timeout so I can tell you just a little bit about our friends over at Manscaped. Summer's coming, and I'm just curious, are you ready to unveil your beach bod? Because you're in luck. Our friends at Manscaped, they just launched their 4th generation performance package, which includes the Lawnmower 4.0. You heard that right, the 4.0. Complement your summer bod with the trim from the leaders in male grooming. The sun is shining and calling your name, fellas. Join the 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for hot guy summer by going to manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping with the code FANSIDED20. It's time to bundle up with the Manscaped Performance Package 4.0. Inside this package, you'll find their Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker, ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver, ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner, performance boxer briefs, and a travel bag to hold on to your goodies. So again, you can get 20% off and free shipping with the code FANSIDED20 at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping with the code FANSIDED20. That's FANSIDED20 at manscaped.com. Escape the shrubs and weeds this summer and shine with Manscaped. All right, you're listening to the Chicago Audible. I'm your host, Will DeWitt. I'm sitting alongside my co-host, Mason West, and we're officially jumping into the first tier of safeties. But Mason, before I do, just give me the green light. We ready to roll?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, so I want to kick off this tier with Eddie Jackson, who, of course, he's going to be sporting number 4 this season. He's one of the players that's taking advantage of the new number flexibility in the NFL. And when you look at Jackson's career, you see some durability. He started in 62 of 64 possible games. He's had some stellar years to kind of start his career, where he had 8 interceptions and 3 touchdowns to go along with 3 forced fumbles and 4 fumble recoveries. The dude was just a turnover machine on this defense, but it really hasn't been the same since. Only 2 interceptions since 2018, none of which came last season, and he's also had some difficulty getting his hands on the ball. 21 PBUs his first 2 seasons, and only 10 the previous 2. Now, there have been some external circumstances that haven't helped him. I think he had, 2 interceptions last year that were kind of taken away. The pass rush, it hasn't been as powerful as it was a couple of years ago. And he's had to adjust with playing some new players next to him for 3 seasons in a row. And let's just not forget, on top of that, it's just so many changes. Chuck Pagano came over Sean Desai. Eddie Jackson's had to deal with a little bit of adversity, but is it still warranted the downtick in his quality of play? So I'm just curious, Mason, when you look back at Eddie Jackson's 2020 campaign, what do you see, what do you like, and what do you think needs some improvement?
Safety is one of those really weird positions where you can be overall a very good safety, but you're so dependent on everything happening in front of you, right? And we talked about this previously with the cornerbacks. The defensive line play is so important. How are the linebackers doing their coverage? Are they passing off tight ends and such effectively? What about the cornerbacks, right? Are they settling into let's say you're playing zone, are they settling into the right zone because you're as the safety, you have to play over the top. Perhaps you're playing the middle third and you notice that the corner on the other side playing the deep third isn't doing their job. Do you roll over and try to help over the top? Do you stay there? It's really is that trickle down effect that if something starts to go wrong, it falls on you. With all of that being said, Eddie Jackson, you are getting paid a lot of money. You need to be making more plays, right? It's just one of those things, unfortunately, that is what it is. You have seen that there were some changes. Like, for example, he was brought on a blitz 14 times last year compared to 1 in 2018 and 9 in 2019. And you see the difference there. I mean, it's Chuck Pagano versus Vic Fangio. I mean, that has to be. Vic just didn't really bring pressure in that kind of a way. So he just let Eddie Jackson chill back there. Like you said, the difference of having an Adrian Amos who was, like myself, that unsung hero playing in the box versus someone who we're talking about later, Tashaun Gipson, who actually tended to play back a little bit. He only had 6 blitzes, actually, when you look at it last year. So he was playing a little bit more deep. So maybe there was just less opportunity for Eddie Jackson, and something that I think he was getting a lot of flack for, that I was actually all about that too, but actually when you look at the stats, I was talking about his missed tackle percentage. Like, it always seemed like he just wasn't in position, that he was missing some big tackles. When you look at it, it really isn't all that different. It was 17% in 2018, 15% in 2019, and actually only 13% of missed tackles in 2020, missing 13 total. So it wasn't that many, but it just was more inopportune times, it seemed like. Mm-hmm. Plus, he wasn't having those big splash plays that kind of, would make you forget about the occasional missed tackle. So to answer your question, it is a combination of both.
Yeah, it is. And you talked about the missed tackling, and you mentioned it. If there were those plays to kind of counteract it, you remember the touchdowns, you remember the picks. And when you don't have those to kind of erase your memory a bit, you can really start nitpicking at some of these. I do believe, though, tackling still needs to be cleaned up. Even though he's missed tackles consistently throughout his career, it's still something he should be working on and getting better at. If my calculations are correct, 41 missed tackles over his last 3 years. And last season, he was missing a tackle on about 1/5 of those tackle attempts. And just in terms of coverage, I know he wasn't targeted a ton, but when he was, he did allow the second worst pass rating for safeties with at least 365 coverage snaps. The pass rating was like 139.6. And he also allowed a completion percentage of 76%, which was the worst since his rookie season. So we did see some downtick there from Eddie Jackson, allowing 15.5 yards per catch, worst of his career, and was the 12th highest for any safety last season. But I still can't help but think that new defensive coordinator Sean Desai is really going to help Eddie Jackson's play. We can all agree that Eddie was playing his best ball under former defensive coordinator Vic Fangio, and it was really more under Chuck Pagano where we saw things get pretty vanilla. And not just for the safeties, that's the entire defense. The expectation is that Desai is going to bring back that aggressive mentality. And not only that, but I believe Desai is going to, get back to being creative, create some new wrinkles and disguises in coverage, something that kind of got lost during the 2 years over the Pagano regime. But what about you, Mason? Thoughts about just Sean Desai and his potential of being a driving force behind a bounce-back season for Eddie Jackson?
So I'm going to start this by saying I am very excited for Sean Desai to be taking over as defensive coordinator. There's a reason he has the nickname the Professor. He's a very smart dude. He knows what he's doing. He studied under some really smart and tactful defensive coordinators. But we also have to remember that it isn't an apples-to-apples situation, right? How many times have we seen someone from the Bill Belichick coaching tree go on and not last as a head coach? Now, that is different, of course, head coach versus a defensive coordinator. If there was someone that I believe could make a transition like this and make a big impact, it'd be someone like Sean Desai. But if we put all of our eggs in that basket and not hold these players accountable as well, then we're doing them a disservice.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. I really hope, though, that if Sean Desai can come here and he does want these players playing a little bit more aggressive. I know Eddie Jackson throughout this offseason was praising this promotion and saying that Sean is going to, hold this whole defense accountable to be playing at a higher level and bringing back some of that attitude that maybe was lost over the last couple of seasons. And on top of that, we'll talk about this player next, but I also believe it is worth noting just how much having Tashaun Gipson back is going to help Eddie Jackson. I mentioned it earlier, 2 straight years with Adrian Amos, and then Jackson had to play with a new guy 2 years in a row. And now that the musical chairs at safety is over for at least another year, Jackson, he's going to have pre-established chemistry with another safety on this defense entering camp, and they can actually build off of a season playing together. And they already have a feel for one another, and I think that familiarity is going to go a long way towards helping them play faster, communicate more effectively in a game, and just have less confusion along the way. I'm curious, Mason, is there anything that you wanted to chip in on when it comes to the impact of Eddie Jackson having a familiar face alongside him in Tashaun Gipson?
Having that familiarity is always really important. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. If you're talking about real life, how we are with friends, family, coworkers, or something like football, especially when it comes to something like football where it's so reactionary. You have to be able to trust the person that's across from you, and you have to be able to make split-second decisions. I gave the example earlier, right, that if maybe the cornerback isn't necessarily doing their job covering that deep third. You, as Eddie Jackson, need to be able to trust that I can still play center field and not cheat over that way, and that's even more important when you look at that safety tandem. So absolutely, that should help. It was a little odd how long it took them to lock on to Tashaun Gipson. We'll get there when we talk about him a little bit more. But is there an awkwardness there? Is there a bit of a fit issue, or else would they have signed him immediately?
Yeah, we'll talk about Gibson here in just a few moments. I just have a few more questions about Eddie Jackson. We just talked about the benefit of having Tashaun Gipson still with them. But Mason, throughout my preparations, I couldn't help but wonder about the impact of losing a Kyle Fuller for an Eddie Jackson as well. Because, again, you don't have to have your eyes always peeking Kyle Fuller's way back in the past. You can keep him on an island for the most part and trust that he's going to be able to get the job done. Of course, you're going to have some help whenever you have big number ones and they're streaking down the sideline. But now with Desmond Trufant potentially, Jalen Johnson, Kendall Vildor, I think that may change how the safeties even have to approach the rest of this defense and how they kind of interact and have relationships with the corners. What kind of impact would you envision a loss of Kyle Fuller having on someone like an Eddie Jackson?
I mean, it's going to be huge. If you just look at how Kyle Fuller played, first off, it was something I've mentioned this in previous podcasts that actually annoyed me how much he played off. But the fact that he kept everything in front of him. And so you really don't have to worry about getting beat deep in that scenario unless it's supposed to be passed off. So simply by play style is one thing. Now, on top of that, who is going to be that cornerback too? We talked about that in a previous episode too. If it's someone like a Desmond Trufant, you have no connection to him besides the fact that you saw him play defense for the Lions, twice. So there's really nothing that you can really trust there. And if you're Eddie Jackson, what about looking at, someone like a Kendall Villador who hasn't really been in that starting role? You may know that person better, a little bit more of that brotherhood, being in the locker room, things like that, but you haven't logged a lot of minutes playing together, communicating together, the little head nods, the hand signals that you're going to do. So that is absolutely a big part of this.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's something as we go through training camp and preseason and early on this year, and whoever earns that starting corner role, kind of keeping an eye on if he is causing issues for someone like an Eddie Jackson and the rest of the safeties. One final question about Eddie Jackson before we move on. We've talked about a few reasons why Eddie Jackson should be returning to form, but Mason, do you expect it? What type of season do you believe is in store for Jackson and why?
I think there's going to be a bit of a regression to the mean. That he had that amazing 2018 and a pretty down 2020. That the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. That this might just be who he is as a person, and that actually connects to something that was said in that ESPN ranking when they did safeties. An NFC executive said he has a very good trait with his ability to take the ball away. Good, not great athlete. Lacks special top end speed, and he's been inconsistent as a tackler. Not the most physical. That sounds relatively typical. It's not the most embellishing of descriptions. You would hope that you'd want a little bit better than that, but that might just be who he is. He's someone that ball hawks really well, but he needs everything to be right in front of him to be able to do that. Now, Eddie has to back up a lot of what he's saying. I mean, he's putting on Instagram and Twitter a lot of smack right now. If you look at his pinned tweet, it's I take all this ish personal. Good. You should take it personal. You had 0 interceptions last year. I don't care that 2 got taken away. Step up, man.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think we do need to expect him to step up, hold him accountable to that high standard. Maybe not 2018 standard, but getting paid like he's getting paid. He needs to be one of those top safeties in the league, not giving up a pass rating of 140, not allowing 78% of passes completed against him, and not missing 1/5 of his tackle attempts. Those are all things that cannot happen again. I trust that Eddie Jackson, with that chip on his shoulder, maybe some of that disrespect can turn into some fuel and motivation for him to play better. And with that, we will see how it all shakes out for the former All-Pro. But let's move on and let's take a look at the other returning starter, someone who I gave my underrated Bear Award back in January for his play last season, and that's going to be Tashaun Gipson. Gibson finished the season with 2 interceptions to go along with 3 PBUs. He's entering his 10th season in the NFL, and he now has 120 career starts underneath his belt. Those 2 picks last season was his 6th year with multiple interceptions. His 66 combined tackles were good for the second most in his career, and even though Gibson didn't have what I'll call a, quote, career year or anything like that, when I reflect on his 2020, I'm still very pleased with what I see. He allowed the second lowest pass rating on the team behind Kyle Fuller, and his 27 snaps per reception allowed was also the second best for Chicago. And not only was Gibson touted against the pass, but he's also very good in run support, a top 15 safety in the NFL with exactly 15 run stops. So Mason, I think it's evident that I'm excited and that I'm glad that Tashaun Gipson is back for another go in Chicago, but how about you? Are you looking forward to another year of Gibson in this defense, and why or why not?
I am. And that's why I was really surprised, like I said earlier, that it seemed like, the Bears drug their feet a little bit bringing him back in. Now, we don't know. Maybe that was him. Maybe he was really saying, like, oh, I deserve more money than the Bears are willing to pay me right now. So, we don't know what the full story is. But I thought he did a really good job. He made some splash plays, which were awesome. He had 2 interceptions, like you said. Tackling was pretty sure. I mean, he only missed 3 tackles with 4.3%, which was pretty fantastic. It's weird, though, if you follow the money, which usually speaks so true. He had signed a $1.83 million deal, 1.3 of that guaranteed. But if you look and compare that to some of the other safeties on this team, Bush, he had a $1.5 million with $750,000 guaranteed, and DeAndre-Houston Carson was at $1.127 mil with about a little over $900,000 guaranteed. So they're all kind of in the same ballpark. So your starting safety, right, is currently making a titch more, than your two backups who are ultimately your backups. So I think that does speak to how the Bears feel a bit about him, which is surprising considering how solid he was last year.
Yeah, and the fact it took so long, and apparently he didn't get an offer somewhere else that he thought was worth maybe going, elsewhere. And I'm glad that even though he's not getting paid a lot of money, he's someone that is still coming here to Chicago and wanting to play in this defense and is excited to be back as well. And when I look at Gibson, I noted a few things that he did well. I failed to mention just how well of a solid tackler he is. Only 6 misses last year, and his 8.3% miss rate was the 13th lowest of 64 safeties that played on 550 or more snaps. Are there any concerns to Gibson's game that you're kind of thinking through as we're entering this season? I know when we brought him in last year, something that intrigued me but also worried me is the fact that he's not a true box safety. He's played in both positions pretty well throughout his career. He's played in, I think, 6 different defenses, and he's played both free and strong depending on whatever the defensive coordinator really asked of him. And I feel like that interchangeability can be both a blessing and a curse for the Bears.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right there. It's odd to have, basically they're playing the same position. They're both free safeties that they're asked to play strong safety more often. And that's one of the reasons why when we were doing some of our mock drafts earlier in the year that I was saying I wanted them to draft another safety and someone who was a more in the box guy. If you look, Dion Bush, we'll talk about him, was used a little bit in that big nickel, which you do kind of when you don't have a true strong safety, someone that you can really stick their nose in there. I think that really hurts them, just not being able to have that person that's going to come down and help on that run support more consistently. And you saw that when Adrian Amos left, right? I mean, Adrian Amos was the perfect partner for Eddie Jackson. So it's not Gibson's fault. It's just you have 2 squares when you need a square and a circle.
Ooh, that's a really good analogy. I like that. We have 2 squares in the back of this Bears defense. Is there anything that you want Gibson to kind of clean up or work on when you reflect? I feel like he was just pretty solid all the way around. Nothing was glaring for me. And again, entering his 10th season, I feel like we get what we get when it comes to Tashaun Gipson.
I tried to find something that I was like, this needs to be better, even just to nitpick. And there really wasn't a lot. Like you said, it was just solid all across the board. Maybe to be able to get his hands on some more balls, break that for a sound clip. But other than that, I mean, just keep doing what he's doing.
Hey, there we go. I'm going to write that down here on my notepad. But before I do, I just want to mention, too, that Sean Desai is excited to have Gibson around. I know last season he kept talking him up in a few interviews that Sean Desai had and just kept mentioning, Gibson's confidence, his willingness and eagerness to just learn this defense, and just rereading some of the things that were said like last October, last November. It just gets me a little bit more excited about what a year or two for Tashaun Gipson can be in this defense. Again, he's had years where he's had 5, 6 interceptions as well. But as Mason, you mentioned with Eddie Jackson, that regression to the mean a bit. They only had 2, but 2 is a solid number for someone who's your second safety technically in this defense. I take it. Preferably we can get, like you said, maybe a few more PBUs, pass breakups, more turnovers. But again, Gibson's a very solid, not spectacular player. And right now I'm okay with exactly that being the case. All right, let's move on to tier number 2, which I am dubbing familiar backups. And let's kind of begin this tier by looking at a player that was in the running for a starting spot this time a year ago. And even though he didn't win it, this player brings a ton of value to this defense. And that's the now 6th-year pro, Dion Bush. You don't see him on the field too much. He's only seen about 5% roughly of the defensive snaps the last 2 years. But in those limited looks last year, he did come away with a pick, and he allowed a completion percentage of only 50% and a passer rating of only 23.6. Now, of course, those numbers can easily look good when you get 1 interception. You had like 6 targets the entire season go your way, and you only allowed 3 receptions. But Dion Bush, he is someone that's always been available for us. He's played in 65 games since entering the league, and he's a good option to put in when the Bears, as Mason mentioned, want to bring in an extra DB on the field when going into like a dime or a big nipple type of formation. So, Mason, when it comes to Dion Bush, do you believe that he's a valuable depth type of player in this defense here in 2021? He's someone that I feel like he's gotten a couple opportunities to knock on a door for a starting spot, hasn't been able to secure one, so he's kind of stuck in this reserve backup role. I think that's what he's going to be at this stage of his career, but I also feel like there's some good value in that, and having someone on your team, in your defense, that knows it inside and out, like a Dion Bush. But do you still see the value here this season?
So if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can hear Nick talking about how important Dion Bush is, since he's one of his favorite players. But in all seriousness, he's just, again, this is kind of, every time I do a group, I try to think of a word to encompass each player and then the group as a whole. And I kept coming back to just solid for the group. And Dion Bush, I felt like, was the penultimate definition of solid. But again, he comes in. It's not like there's nothing significantly crazy what he does. Like, he only played 6% of snaps last year. Like you said, with that 1 reception, 2 passes defended, and had 10 total tackles. I mean, that's what else do you really want him to do on 6% of snaps? He gets taken advantage of a little bit by tight ends. It's, he gave up 50% completions, but really small sample size. It was only about 6 passes we're talking about here. But he had 43% of his snaps, of the special team snaps, so definitely important role there. And you have to be, if you're going to be that third or even fourth safety. He's just there. He fills the hole when needed, right? It's not like the safeties get tired consistently, so you need to sub in a safety. Heaven forbid there is an injury that happens. I mean, we saw that when Eddie Jackson went down, unfortunately, back in 2018, and individuals had to step in. You noticed that Eddie wasn't there, but you weren't pulling your hair out, like freaking out that he wasn't there. Like, there weren't a ton of huge plays in that Eagles game where you knew for sure that, oh man, we're missing Eddie Jackson. It's a weird middle that Dion Bush can fill.
Yeah, and going back, again, you want to look at this group as a whole, and that's what we're doing here as we're previewing the position. Maybe that's part of the blessing of a Tashaun Gipson, right? The interchangeability a bit, because if something does happen to an Eddie Jackson, then you have Gibson, who's more of a free safety than a strong safety, so can go play that Eddie Jackson role, and then you have Dion Bush that can go in there and be your box guy, be that strong safety one. Now, of course, Desai might not have that versatility that he did have prior, but at least you have 2 guys that can fill each role pretty well, respectively. But you mentioned it, Dion Bush, not on the field a lot last year. If I remember correctly, we saw more early compared to the end of the season, and a lot of that was due to just Danny Trevathan and his struggles in coverage, and the Bears trying to find a solution to just stop the bleeding there, and that's why they opted to take Danny off the field to bring on someone else who's better in coverage, like a Dion Bush. And we'll see how much the Bears want to actually tap into the package that is the Dion Bush one this year, but whatever it is, it's probably not going to be much more than what we saw a year ago. I want to go ahead and move forward, and let's take a look at Bush's 2016 draft class comrade, someone who has been seeing a little bit more playing time on defense than ever before, and that's DHC, DeAndre-Houston Carson. He saw 91 snaps on defense, which blew his previous career high of 41 completely out of the water. And I presume fans too, but myself included, I love about those limited looks. What I do, it's just the fact that he made the most of them. Heck, he did his best. I'm going to call it a Mike Brown impression by sealing back-to-back wins with that PBU against Tom Brady on that 4th down, and then the following week intercepting Teddy Bridgewater to put that game on ice. DHC, he's been a career special teamer, but I think he proved last season that throughout all of those years, waiting deep on the depth chart, he was still active and engaged in that defensive back room. And he's just, last year, I can call him Johnny on the spot. So Mason, what did DHC show you last year that gives you confidence that he can be serviceable on defense in, I'm going to call specific circumstances? Don't think we want to rely on him, in place of a starter full time. I think you know what I mean. I'm trying to be kind on how I phrase this.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to bring up those 2 exact plays you mentioned, the Buccaneers and the Panthers plays, because when I think DHC last year, those are the 2 that immediately come to mind. It was just, hey, he stepped up when he needed to, and that's what you get out of a 3rd, 4th, or arguably interchangeable safety. What else do you really want in that scenario? Again, he isn't really playing a lot of snaps on defense. He's going to fill most of that role on special teams, 82% of special team snaps, which is huge, especially when we've talked about in that special teams episode how many individuals were leaving that were kind of stalwarts in there. He does exactly what he needs to do. He comes in, he makes a play, he goes and sits on the bench and he chills. Like, what else do you really want from the guy?
Yeah, exactly. That's literally about it when it comes to DHC. Again, usually he'll appear on maybe 1% of defensive snaps per season. It's nothing at all. What he did last year, though, and what I was just, I guess, proud to see, because he's been around for a long time and just doesn't get a lot of opportunity, is that he kind of filled in that Sherrick McManus role that we saw in 2018. You know, someone that came out there, that extra defender, and opposing quarterback see that new guy. I mean, heck, Tom Brady saw number 36 out there and immediately was like, oh, I got to go pick on that guy. And he was able to break that pass up. And then the following week, Teddy Bridgewater made the same exact mistake. And that's really best case scenario for us. If DHC's out there and a quarterback wants to give him a test and he's out there giving it his all and being right in the right spot and knowing his read, knowing what he needs to do, and he ends up making good play, and I think that's an extra bonus along the way. So that's really DHC, unless, Mason, you have a tremendous amount of additional analysis that I just was not prepared for.
Not specifically DHC, but kind of the depth as a whole here. We talked about this a little bit before the show started. It's almost a little frustrating because you always want competition. And as of right now, especially as we're talking, I'm sure, the chat and those who are listening can feel that there's not competition. The two that are starting. And then after this, it's just, there's some of these other people. While DeAndre-Houston, Carson, Dion Bush, they're solid. You almost just wish there was this one of them was really pushing like Gibson, challenging that other safety spot. And we're just not getting that.
Yeah. And this is a team that's been really kind of, trying to create competition throughout all their positions, and out of all of them, this one probably does feel the most lacking, at least from someone pushing a starter. I think the back end of the depth chart here for safety, they're all kind of battling, and it's a good one, but there's no one that's pushing any of the top two guys. On top of that, I saw in the chat, Cliff said he wouldn't compare DHC to Mike Brown, and I think I would agree, but if memory serves me correctly, there was a stretch like the 2004-2005 season where Mike Brown sealed back-to-back games with an interception, so I was saying he did his best Mike Brown impersonation just due to that fact. Just want to make sure it's clear. I've watched Bears defenses enough to know the difference of a Mike Brown and a defense in a DeAndre-Houston Carson. All right, so we have one more tier to go, just two more players as well, small group. So tier 3, it's going to be dubbed the rest, and we have two players here in the final tier. We have Marquis Christian, who has 56 games of experience since entering the league as a 5th-round pick in 2016, and after 4 years with the Rams, the Bears signed him last summer. Actually, this got really weird. So the Bears signed him, and then the Jets decided that they're going to poach him off the practice squad. Well, let's go back even one step further. Early on, last offseason, 2020, Marqui Christian signed with the Jets, but then they couldn't get to final terms on a contract, so he was like, I'm going to look elsewhere. Signed with the Bears. Goes on the Bears practice squad. Jets decide to sign him. They keep him around for a bit, cut him. Then the Bears decide, you know what, we're going to bring Marquis Christian back. He went back in the practice squad, and that's where he sat for the rest of the year. In Marquis Christian's previous 2 seasons, though, he saw about 1/3 of the defensive snaps and 78% of special team snaps for Wade Phillips and the Rams in what I would call a hybrid safety linebacker role, so like a jackbacker. And then there's also Jordan Lucas, who's been primarily a special teams player throughout his career. He's appeared in 49 career games, 4 starts in 2018 for Kansas City. He signed with the Bears last offseason, but he opted out due to COVID. And when you just look at his career, only 3 PBUs and 1 interception, and he's only averaged about 3% of defensive snaps per season. So most of his value in his career has came on special teams, where he's seen about 50% of those snaps in his active seasons. So Mason, we've done plenty of Countdown to Camp episodes. You know the question. Who do you like out of this duo, and why?
Marquis Christian has the best hair. So if we're going by that, he wins. But if we're going by who actually has a higher chance to make the roster, I would have to go with Jordan Lucas on that, simply due to, being in Kansas City for 2 years, right? There's just that little bit of a connection there. I really think he had a chance to last year. If he hadn't opted out, he really could have pushed maybe DHC for that final safety role. The Bears clearly were looking for that too later in the year, as, Marquis Christian did get elevated for the wild card game. He did get, he had 1 snap on defense and a couple on special teams. So, they needed that extra person there. I think Lucas did himself a little bit of a disservice. This is one of those times where opting out, I think, kind of hurt him, because he really could have sustained a role So reports are from Hub Arkush that he's going to be pushing for a gunner role specifically this year. So that'll be really interesting, especially with Cordero Patterson not being here anymore. He was so good at that job. Refs were calling penalties because his hit was just perfectly timed, and apparently the human eye couldn't detect it from the field. So there's a chance he pushes it. It really is going to boil down to, by him, I mean Jordan Lucas. It's really going to boil down to, those other positions. Are you going to keep like a fifth safety instead of a fifth running back? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because in years past, the Bears have carried about 5 safeties a season. But when you look at the corner depth and how that's kind of shaking out, running back, as you mentioned, heck, next week we talk quarterbacks. Are they going to have to keep 3? And if so, where's that roster spot go? So it gets real interesting how the Bears are going to kind of adjust the second half of the depth chart for safety, because they have to have special teams presence, number one, but also you need to trust them enough to jump in and play if needed, which is why my gut reaction maybe leans towards a Marquis Christian, just because he's had more experience playing in defenses. Again, over 2 years in the Rams, his previous 2 seasons there, he played on 1/3 of those defensive snaps, again, in those sub packages, but he is someone that at least Wade Phillips trusted on defense. And I know when you look at Jordan Lucas, it took a lot for him to actually get on the field over there in Kansas City. But special teams wise, maybe Jordan Lucas does have a slight edge there too. So it's an interesting battle. There's not a lot you can really draw on from any guy in terms of what they provide this defense. It's really going to maybe come down to who has the best special teams impact, and also weighing the risk reward of who would you rather have out there in a pinch situation. So, Mason, is there anything else on these two that you wanted to mention before we kind of predict who makes the team?
Well, and after you saying that, I do like the idea of someone like a Marquis Christian doing that jackback role, especially someone like Sean Desai, who in theory he's the person that, like, that mad scientist. I would think that you give him all these pieces and see what comes out of it. Like, you can find someone to be a gunner. You can find someone to make a tackle line kickoff. You may not be able to find someone as easily that can play a hybrid role like Christian was able to do under Wade Phillips. So that might be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, it would be. And again, once you get to camp, how are they deploying? Where are they playing these guys? And in preseason too, maybe that's where some of these players can start separating themselves with how they actually perform on defense in some of these preseason games. So Mason, how many safeties do you have making the team?
I have 4.
You have 4? I went with 5 because I have to do my final 53-man, and I know I'm probably already over. So we're going to go with 5 now. I can have an extra name, and then next week we will clean house just a little bit. So I'm assuming you have Eddie Jackson, Tashaun Gipson, Dion Bush, DHC. Is that it?
Yep, those are my 4.
I figured as such. I'm sneaking in Marquis Christian just a little bit. There's a reason why the Bears brought him in the first time and thought so highly of him to bring him in again after the Jets decided to cut him. Again, I don't know what they're seeing, but they see something. And I feel like to give him another go and to bring him in and to give him another contract for this season, I think it's telling that they want to keep him around. Maybe he's another practice squad guy, but for right now, I'll have him making the team.
As you were describing Marquis Christian's path last year with, on the Jets, not on the Jets, on the Bears, on the Jets, and me, I'm that fantasy football guy. It made me think of that person who just can't stop tweaking their roster, that final spot, and they're freaking out about like the 5th receiver that never is really going to play. Marquis Christian's kind of that guy where it's like, I mean, yeah, they wanted him on the team, but was it simply because he was in their camp and they needed a body versus like, we need Marquis Christian for a real role?
Ooh. I like how you phrased that. We will find out soon enough. And maybe with a year in this defense to learn it and then getting out there this preseason, maybe he shows that he should be sticking around over someone else like a Jordan Lucas. We will find out soon. But Mason, I'm excited because now it's time for us to get to one of our final segments, and it's time to play a little bit of over, under. So my first over-under, I'm going to set the bar at 3 interceptions for Eddie Jackson. Remember, he had the big old goose egg a year ago. 3 INTs for Eddie Jacks. You going to take the over or the under?
I have a bold prediction later that forces me to say this is a push.
Ooh, okay. A push for you. I'm going to take the under at 2, which is what he could have had last season if those penalties didn't take him away. Hopefully he can get higher than that, but I'm trying to set my expectations low so he can exceed them, and I feel happier about what he does next season. So I'll put it at 2 for now. The next over-under, how about 8 PBUs for Eddie Jackson? 5 last year. Can he get a few more?
That one I'll take over. If you look at the high season he had, which I believe was like 15 or 16, without looking at my notes directly, I think he's just going to regress to the mean. 5 was a little low. That 15, 16 was a bit too high. 8 sounds almost like a perfect number. We have been talking about how the pass rush should be better. We've talked about how the linebackers should be relatively solid. That should force a couple more balls to maybe not be as perfectly placed by opposing quarterbacks, allowing for a pass breakup.
Yep. I'm very much in agreement with you. I'm going to say the over as well. I'm going to give him 10. Sounds like a good, solid middle number that you kind of mentioned as well. The next over-under, how about 2 interceptions for Tashaun Gipson? Same amount that he had last year. Does he get any more than that? Does he cut in half? What are you going to do?
I'm going to say over, but hold my specific number for a little bit. I think it's going to be over another year in the system. I think, as we talked about earlier, Sean Desai is going to play some chess with him as this guy that just makes a lot of opportunities, putting him in the right place. So over.
Over. I'm taking the over too. I'll give him a solid 3 or 4. He's had, again, 6 seasons with at least 2. With another year for everything that you mentioned, no reason why you can't get a little bit more. And to round out the starters here, actually I have one more, so I lie. We got 4 PBUs for Tashaun Gipson. Only 3 of those last year. I'm going to take the over. He gets at least 6 this season. How about you?
I'm going to take the over as well for the same reason I just said for the interceptions. I feel like he's going to be used in a way that really, the most to his skills, puts him in the perfect position to be able to get more hands on balls. That's like the 3rd time I've said that this podcast.
And we're really going to have to just make a montage of those sound bites for you.
Oh, that's great. I'm sure that everyone's going to love that.
All right, one last over-under. 135 total tackles for Tashaun Gipson and Eddie Jackson. The number last year combined was 128. So trying to use that extra game into account, 135. And again, maybe if there's better play up front, they don't need to be used as much. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. Are you going to take the over or under?
For that exact reason you actually said, I'm going to take the under. I just think more plays are going to be stopped in front of them, and you're not going to see as many of the Eddie Jackson rolling his shoulder down and hoping that he just hits the legs out from tight end streaking up the field.
Okay, I like it. I'm going to take the under too at about 130. Again, I hope that they don't need to be nearly as active as they were a year ago, and if that's the case, we're probably in for some really good defensive play if the linebackers are cleaning things up before it even gets to that 3rd level of the defense. So, Mason, it's time to do a couple true or falses. My first true or false for you. DeAndre-Houston Carson. He will have more defensive snaps than Dion Bush for the 2nd straight season.
False. Dion Bush just keeps hanging around, but in a different way than DeAndre-Houston Carson. DeAndre-Houston Carson is there consistently as that little filler role, but Dion Bush keeps making these little pop sparkly plays that you're like, oh, that was kind of cool. Oh, that was actually really interesting. So, I think it's going to start to click for him, especially, again, we keep putting a lot on Sean Desai's plate right now, but with a guy like that can really take advantage of his skills.
Okay, I'm going to take true on this one just because, I don't know, I'm following a pattern here. And this is the first time ever last year, and these 2 were drafted the same year. And DHC never played more defensive snaps than Dion Bush. And last year it changed. And Sean Desai is, the former safeties coach. So maybe there's something about it, or maybe Chuck Pagano really liked DHC. I don't know. But whatever reason it is, I'm going to say for some weird reason, DHC will see more defensive snaps than Dion Bush. Again, for me, I don't know if that makes complete sense, but let's see what happens. And the final true or false question for us. Even though he said on the practice squad last season, I said Marquis Christian can play more than 10% of the defensive snaps and be a stud on special teams. And you didn't have him on your final roster, which I knew was a risk when I made this one. So I already know your answer.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely say false on that. And if they needed another safety, I still feel that Jordan Lucas would be the one that was pulled up.
Okay, I'm going to say false as well. I thought 10% was a little high, and that's just kind of where I'll leave it at that. 2 fill in the blanks for us here. First one, if Eddie Jackson returns to his 2018 form, it will most likely be due to blank.
Pass rush.
That was
It's
my
just
next
simple.
one.
Pass rush is any defensive back's best friend.
I'll say Khalil Mack. I'll change it up just a little bit just because of Khalil Mack. Robert Quinn, not so much. Again, we can get pass rush from multiple players on this defense, but if I had to be a little bit more specific here, let's go with Khalil Mack. And then the last fill in the blank, the number one concern that you have for the Bears safeties entering camp is blank.
Missed tackles. While the numbers aren't as horrendous as I thought they were going to be, but they're just you have to pass the eye test still, and the eye test was just not good for specifically Eddie Jackson, and he needs to be able to make those tackles. And if he's not, you can't just be sitting back and chilling and hoping for the best. And then you can't, be when you finally get a pass breakup, being all up in the receiver's face and trying to celebrate when you just missed 2 tackles on the last drive. So you got to wrap up.
You really do. I think my number one concern is just going to lie with, I don't know if I have one word to fill in this blank, but it's going to be, can Sean Desai tap into Eddie Jackson's potential like we saw before? That's kind of my big concern, just because we haven't seen it. I'm very hopeful. If you listen to this episode, I think I'm very hopeful it can happen. But also, until you see it happen, I think there's some right to still be a little wary, a little concerned. And the fact that's my number one concern, I think is a good thing. Because, again, this group is pretty solid overall. All right, Mason, let's jump into our bold predictions that you've been teasing us about here throughout the final portion of our episode. What's going to be your bold prediction for the Bears safeties?
Listeners can probably tease out what mine was going to be, considering what I had said earlier. And it's funny, I actually wrote this specifically down, putting a lot of stock in Sean Desai. Eddie Jackson finds the median with 3 interceptions, while Gibson gets 4 interceptions and doubles Eddie Jackson's passes defended.
I like it. That's bold, and that would be a tremendous achievement for the Bears that can do that. I had 2. One of them slightly outdoes yours. I had 10 total picks between Jackson and Gibson. I didn't have an exact split. If I had to do one on the spot, 6 for Eddie and 4 for Tashaun. And then my other one, 4 total touchdowns for safeties. I thought that was just crazy bold. Like extra sans serif, extreme bold, 900 weighted font type of bold.
Jeez, that almost blows my quarterback bold prediction for next week out of the water.
You already have one ready?
Oh, yeah. I've had this for like 4 or 5 weeks. Are you kidding me?
I love it. I love the preparedness that you're going to be coming into next week's episode with. We'll tease that one here very soon. But before we do, one final thing that we need to do before we wrap up here is give out our confidence meter. We've talked about a fair amount of concerns, a fair amount of reasons for optimism, and some in between along the way. So when you put it all together, Mason, what is or where is your confidence meter for the Bears safeties?
So I said earlier, I always try to find a word that fits the group, and I said solid. So for me, and when I look at that confidence meter, 5 is right in the middle. You're at least average. So that's where you have to start with this. So I went slightly higher with that to a 6.8. While they're gonna get the job done. You're not super worried that all of a sudden a game is going to be blown because of an issue with one of these safeties or even potentially the depth that's there. I am still worried about the downward trajectory we've seen from Eddie Jackson, and whether it was stemming all from the ankle injury he had at the end of that 2018 season, or if it's just simply, again, regression to the mean. Tashaun Gipson, very solid, and he's had some pretty solid years, but those were previously solid years, right? He hasn't really had that currently. So for me, it's just, there's not a lot to be excited about either. There's not a rookie waiting in the wings. There's not the Pro Bowl player that's sitting there, like we've talked about for some of our other positions, the Akeem Hickses of the world, the Khalil Macks, things like that. There's a lack of excitement, a lack of competition. And I think that lack of competition sometimes breeds, just staying status quo.
Yeah. Stagnant a little bit here, right? No new faces. Everyone that we've talked about have been here before. They didn't do any influx of talent throughout this offseason here at the position. I'm a little higher than you. I'm at about a 7.5. Eddie Jackson, I expect him to play with a big chip on his shoulder, be more aggressive, and Sean Desai should help. And also having that tandem of a Gibson, that comfort level, I also think is going to help boost some of that productivity. And Gibson himself, as I mentioned, he's an underrated, solid starting safety. He's proven. And then the depth, it's good, not great. And so just with all that, I think 7.5 feels like a good C, right? C plus, depending on how you're looking at it. So that's kind of where I'm at now. If we can get back to what we saw out of Eddie Jackson a few years ago, obviously that really starts to move this up very quickly. But until we do, you got to be a little reserved here. So I'm sitting at about a 7.5, and I'm hopeful that by the end of this season, we can look back and feel like that was a foolish low number, at least for both Mason and myself when it's all said and done. But again, though, after next year, most of these safeties are up for a contract again, besides Eddie Jackson. So that could all change here in a hurry, too. Mason, is there anything that you wanted to kind of chime in with to kind of close out the show?
No, not really. I mean, I think the tone of the show, I think, is pretty obvious. It's just a very, like I said, it's just a very like, this is what we have. This is what exists currently for the Bears safeties, and it's such a fall from grace from where it was in 2018 when it was running so high with like Eddie Jackson. I feel like was, at least for me, like the captain of that club dub vibe that there was. And there just isn't that feeling. You don't have that club dubness with the safeties and things like that. Versus some of these other positions, there is these little sparks here and there that you're excited about. So just truly hoping that, that can get reversed, that can get flipped. I will say, if you take a peek, Instagram is a great place to see, for example, Eddie Jackson doing some crazy nice workouts. Dr. Michael Tellreiser, he's a great follow on a chiropractor on Instagram. He's putting the work in. He is. So it's what I would have had a football player do to overcome some of the issues that I think we saw with Eddie Jackson. So there's that.
Just that. I think out of every position on this team, inside linebacker and safety are the only two that you get concerned about, like an influx of youth or like someone that's really exciting in the wings. Every other position, I can name one or two players that get me real excited about the potential of the future. But when you think about safety, outside of Eddie Jackson, like what's going to happen? We've been asking the Bears to draft a safety for years, and they haven't done it. And then same thing with inside linebacker too. So just wanted to at least throw that out there because you were going, and I was like trying to go through my head because like, you're right. The tone of this show has just been more matter-of-factly than one of pure enthusiasm that we've had like in previous episodes. Like the running back one on Tuesday, we were like heads over heels of Damian Williams, and then you have Khalil Herbert, and then today is like, well, DHC and Dion Bush and Jordan Lucas. It's a little bit of a different tune, but I think that's going to do it for this episode. Mason, are you proud or embarrassed or somewhere in between that we didn't make a full hour, even though you and I talked for over an hour on Bears special teams?
I think I'm proud of how we did with the special teams one, and saddened by the fact that we couldn't get enough on the safeties.
Yeah, well, special teams does have some more nuances to it. They talk about the return game and core special teamers. This one's just more two starters and backups. So it did make our job a little bit more difficult, but still getting near this hour mark, I feel proud that we're able to do that without getting, ragging on previous play too much, finding good reasons for optimism for the future without setting the expectations super sky high. So I thought we did a really good job of keeping this where it needed to go. But let's go ahead and let's call that an episode. Thank you to everyone for watching or listening to the show. We really appreciate you all. Don't forget to leave a review of our show over on Apple Podcasts. We're only 10 away from reaching our goal of 700. And more importantly, sending out a free Bears jersey to one lucky listener. Help us reach more Bears fans like us, like you, by leaving a review over on Apple Podcasts. We'll be back next Tuesday night for the stream and Wednesday morning for the podcast with our final episode of Countdown to Camp for 2021. It's the grand finale, and it's going to be our preview of the Chicago Bears quarterbacks. Will Andy Dalton be the starter week one? And if so, what should we expect from the vet? Is Nick Foles actually going to make the final roster? And of course, Justin Fields. We'll discuss the current state of the Bears quarterbacks in just a few days, but until then, bear down, Chicago.